All right, let's dive right into this. When we think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, our minds usually jump straight to profound ancient mysteries and sacred untouched texts. But there's actually a deeply ironic, totally fascinating story hiding right beneath the surface. It's really the tale of two completely opposing groups of people separated by 2 millennia. On one hand, you've got the ancient sect that wrote the scrolls, a group so radically pure and strict that their daily habits would sound completely absurd to us today. And on the other hand, we have the finders, the mid-20th century academic team who translated them. They were brilliant, for sure, but also incredibly chaotic, eccentric, and heavily flawed. So today, we're going to map out the wild history of how the absolute most important archaeological find of the 20th century was actually handled. But to really grasp the intense pressure these modern scholars were under from the get-go, we have to talk about the financial stakes. And honestly, the most shocking figure in this whole saga is $2.80. That was the price per square centimeter that scholars ultimately had to agree to pay a Palestinian middleman named Kondo just to get their hands on the texts. See, the local Bedouin were constantly beating the archaeologists to the caves. This meant the scholars were literally forced to beg, borrow, and scrape together funds by any means necessary just to buy back these priceless ancient fragments piece by piece. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at assembling the scroll team, eccentrics in the scrollery, who were the Essenes, life at Qumran, and finally, the Essene Gate.
First up, assembling the scroll team.
The monumental, almost impossible task of editing thousands of these tiny fragments fell to Roland Duval. He was a French Dominican priest, an archaeologist, and a highly respected biblical historian. Working out of the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, he basically had to put together an academic dream team, though honestly, ragtag is probably a much better word for this crew. You had Frank Marr Cross, a brilliant young scholar from Johns Hopkins, whose big contribution was dating the texts by their paleography, which is just the shape of the letters. Then there's Józef Milek, a Polish priest famously known as the fastest man with a fragment. But then you get into the wild cards. You've got John Allegro, a British Protestant turned agnostic, who Cross famously described as one of the few amoral people he'd ever met, and John Strugnell, an incredibly brilliant but highly erratic British linguist. It was a totally unique, highly volatile mix of big personalities. And behind the scenes, this whole translation effort was absolutely plagued by intense drama. First off, you had massive political pressure. Because East Jerusalem was under Jordanian control at the time, no Israeli or Jewish scholars were even invited to join the initial team. Then come the personal betrayals. John Allegro would literally take materials from other scholars, borrow scrolls, and just publish them without permission. He eventually went on to write these sensationalist, unreadable books like The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Meanwhile, John Strugnell, who actually did a lot to help bring Jewish and Israeli scholars onto the team later on, suffered a really tragic downfall. He struggled deeply with alcoholism and manic depression and ultimately lost his position after making some truly horrible remarks about Judaism to an Israeli journalist while under the influence.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Eccentrics in the Scrollery.
Knowing the deeply flawed, eccentric nature of these guys, we have to take a look inside their actual workspace at the Rockefeller Museum. They affectionately called this room the Scrollery. What you're seeing here is Józef Milek, our fastest man with a fragment, hard at work. And what is honestly horrifying to any modern historian is the fact that he is smoking a cigarette directly above 2,000-year-old sacred texts. He is quite literally dropping ash perilously close to the most important archaeological discovery of the century. Unless you think this was just one careless guy having a bad day, nope, here is G. Lancaster Harding doing the exact same thing, just casually smoking a cigarette right over ancient, crumbling bits of parchment. Now, it was obviously a heady, exciting time for these scholars as they literally pieced history back together, but their approach to preservation was, well, incredibly loose.
To really put this into perspective, let's compare their 1950s methods to modern standards. Back then, not only were they smoking over the fragments, they were actually using everyday Scotch tape to piece these 2,000-year-old texts together. I mean, today that is completely, absolutely unthinkable. In fact, subsequent generations of conservators have literally had to spend decades doing meticulous, painstaking restoration work just to clean that awful sticky tape residue off the priceless leather and papyrus.
Okay, moving on to Chapter 3. Who exactly were the Essenes? So we've seen the chaotic, careless modern finders. Now let's completely pivot and travel way back in time to the people who actually authored these sacred texts. Who were they? Well, most scholars identify the writers as the Essenes. They referred to themselves as Ha-Yahad, which translates simply to the community. Originating around 160 BC, they were extremely pious, strictly Orthodox Jews. They basically physically separated themselves from mainstream society and what they saw as the perverse side of culture to attain total moral perfection, maintain ultra-strict ritual purity, and wait for the coming of the Messiah. Now, a super common question people ask is why aren't they mentioned in the Gospels, and what did they actually think of Jesus? Well, you have to understand the Essenes were priestly apocalyptics. Their sectarian literature talked constantly about a massive, violent apocalyptic war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. So when a rabbi from Nazareth comes along preaching a message of love and willingly allowing himself to die on a cross, it simply did not match their expectations at all. They were looking for a very different outcome, so they likely just didn't see Jesus for who he was.
Let's look at Chapter 4, Life at Qumran. So how did these folks actually live while they were out there waiting for the end of the world? Out in the Judean desert at their settlement in Qumran, the ancient historian Josephus numbered them at right around 4,000 individuals, and their day-to-day life was intensely rigorous. They practiced communal living with a shared treasury, shared quarters, and a self-appointed life of poverty. Their communal meals were treated as highly sacred events, and perhaps most importantly for them, they engaged in intense ritual bathing for purity. Archaeologists have actually found 10 mikvahs, or ritual baths, at the Qumran site alone. It's really fascinating because their rigorous simplicity and incredible discipline heavily parallel the Christian monastic movements that came later.
And finally, Chapter 5, the Essene Gate.
Which brings us to a final, and frankly, kinda hilarious point about their absolute obsession with purity. The Essenes viewed the city of Jerusalem as being so intensely sacred and holy that they categorically refused to defecate inside the city walls. They truly believed that fulfilling a basic, natural biological need would pollute the holy city. So, what did they do? Well, according to historians, you would quite literally see these deeply pious Essenes holding their bottoms and sprinting out of the city gates to a designated place outside the walls just to relieve themselves.
This artist's reconstruction here is based on excavations done back in the 1980s by Bargil Pixner over on Mount Zion, and it brilliantly illustrates this level of dedication. You can see the 3 superimposed gateways identified as the Essene Gate, located right above the Hinnom Valley. Through this exact gate, the Essenes would rush out to a specific spot called Beit Sol to use the restroom, doing absolutely everything in their power to maintain their flawless standard of ritual purity while inside the city limits.
And honestly, that right there brings us to the core irony of this whole shebang. Just look at the immense contrast we've explored today. On one side, you have the Essenes, ancient people so entirely consumed by purity and perfection that they would literally sprint outside a city to avoid polluting it. And on the exact opposite side, you have the 1950s modern scholars. Brilliant men, sure, but plagued by alcoholism, bitter rivalries, and casually smoking directly over these very same sacred texts while literally holding them together with Scotch tape. It leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on. How do the biases, the flaws, and the deeply human habits of our modern finders fundamentally shape the way we uncover, preserve, and interpret the sacred past? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible slice of history today.